Taping oral history interview, Richard Keep, 92nd Cavalry Reconnaissance, 12th Armored Division, World War II. Interview being taped at 64th Reunion, Indianapolis, Indiana, August 7th, 2010. First, Richard, I want to thank you for agreeing to sit down with me.
You're more than welcome.
And the way we do this is we just pretty much start from the very beginning. When the war started and when you were brought into the Army, what were you doing beforehand?
I was a farm kid.
Whereabouts?
Iowa.
And so I take it, were you drafted or did you volunteer? Okay. Tell me, how much of a shock was it to go into the Army after working on a farm?
Well, there's really no shock. It was just one of those things everybody was doing. So it was just a kind of an accepted thing that you had to go, so just get on the bus. Mm-hmm. So if you want a kind of a preempt deal of how I got, or what happened till I got to the 12th, was an interesting story.
Yes, please.
I went to Fort Riley, Kansas. And at Fort Riley, Kansas, they had what they called a CRT, which means Cavalry Replacement Training Center. So that's why the cavalry business. So when we went in there in about the middle of August, they said, when you get out of here, there isn't anything in this man's army you won't be able to do. Any kind of a weapon, any kind of a vehicle, you'll be able to handle it. But we're going to get you out of here quick, but you're going to be a replacement. So Christmas, I was home in Iowa, done with my basic training, August through the middle of December. That was all the basic training. So I went home for Christmas, and New Year's Eve I was on the train headed for Fort Meade, Maryland. And I had 3 weeks more of just simulated same stuff I had in Fort Riley, and then I was loaded on a ship. That's how long my training was. The 1st of February I was in Barry, Wales. And they took us from there to a little town in southern England, which there were 75 of us. That's all that shipped out together. The rest of them were scattered to every camp all over the United States. And at this was in Glastonbury, England, and we were put into a abandoned Italian prisoner of war camp. The Italians had left and shipped to the United States, and we were put in that camp. And from there they came and picked and sorted, and I done nothing but flunky, drive trucks, went into London with a lot of loads, came back, jeep, transport prisoners, whatever they wanted you to do. Well, believe it or not, I done all that for about 2 months, and then they came along and said, can you do the close order drill? And I said, well, yes. And they said, all right, we're going to take 12 of you. And we trained for 3 weeks, dropping our rifles, throwing them over our shoulders, this kind of stuff. And then we went to a parade before the King and Queen of England, amongst a lot of other different things they had in this parade. But that's kind of making a long story short. But then I was shipped out eventually to Tidworth Barracks. Well, Tidworth Barracks had what they called Tent City, or they had Tidworth proper, which was all brick building. Well, then they had me driving a truck again, back and forth to London and wherever. Well, then they came and got me, and they said, well, here you go. We're going to take you to a little tent city south of Tidworth Barracks. And of all things, I got put in with 299 from detention camps. Now, people never have heard of this before, but they had 299 GIs that were brought over from AWOL, robbery, assault, whatever, but they were all the bad eggs. I was never in trouble, but they just needed one more man. So, so anyway, we trained there for about 3 weeks. But in that training, they actually took these people out to a rifle range, and there was a lot of them couldn't even load rifles. They didn't know how to load a rifle. So the sergeant said to me, he said, well, looks like you know how. And I said, well, yeah. He said, would you help me a little bit? So I actually helped some of those people, and they were sent to be infantry replacements. Well, after 3 weeks, they come and got us at midnight, and they started loading them on trucks. Well, they got to my name, and they called my name out, and I went forward to the truck, and the guy grabbed me, and he said, you don't go. And I said, now what do I do? And he said, I don't know, but just step aside. So they loaded the 299 on the trucks, and away they went. So he said, well, you go find a place to sleep and come down and eat breakfast with us in the morning. It was just a small group of tents, really. So I went down and ate breakfast with him the next morning. He said, I still don't know where you go. So about noon, he said, well, come down at noon. So I went down and ate with him, and he said, I got a place for you. Just come back down here at 1 o'clock with what little stuff you got, which was very little. And so then I went to the 12th Armored, because a guy had fell off a Jeep and broke his collarbone, and I was his replacement. So anyway, you know, it's a kind of a long story, but if you're a replacement, you are a lost soul, because you don't know anybody or anything. Everywhere you turn is a stranger. You couldn't hardly mail a letter. You couldn't hardly get a letter. Partial pay was about all I ever had, because they could never find you. So that's how I joined the 12th. But after I got to the 12th, then I was assigned to the 92nd, and they were still flunking me around in this little group, which was a very small group. But finally I wrote a letter, and I said, like I wrote it to my dad, I said, they won't give me a chance in this new place where I'm at, but I said, I can do anything anybody can do in this thing. I was getting kind of disgusted, of course, but you know, in 2 days, here come this lieutenant, where he'd censored my letter. So he said, I understand you can run a mortar, and you're a Jeep driver, any of that stuff, and I said, yeah, I've done it all. He said, there's your Jeep, I'll have 2 guys in your crew, and there's your mortar. But that's how I got to the 12th. Now to get back to this one big story, or a kind of a humorous story, we were going through, and we were, like I say, we were a small group, not much armor, armored cars and Jeeps. That's all we had. Nothing, no tanks, nothing big. But we was going into this village, but it was setting in a valley, high hills both sides, one road out in, one road out. And we couldn't get through there because they were stopping us no matter what. But they weren't pushing us, they just wouldn't let us through. So they'd set up their machine guns, and they'd shoot at us, we'd shoot at them, but it didn't seem to make any difference. They weren't moving, and we didn't have enough to get through. But we did have artillery at times behind us. They'd shell it, and then we had planes that would strafe and through incendiaries, and that went on for 2 days. Finally, the 3rd day, the lieutenant said, we're going to go try to capture a prisoner and see what we can find out. So there was one big hillside with a lot of timber down, not very far from this house where we had kind of set up headquarters in. And so they took 9 of us. And there was a lieutenant, and he took 4 guys, and this little sergeant, and took 3 guys, and I was one of those 3. Well, we separated, so they went one way and went the other, and it was a real steep hill, all covered with timber, but open spots here and there. So we go up this hill, and we said, all right, at such and such a time, you be back here. the other group don't make it, get on back and maybe bring help, but don't wait on us. So we took the four of us went up to one side, and we're kind of sneaking along through the timber and out into the open. If we see a spot, and this little sergeant pointed, he said, "Look up there." And here's a German helmet sticking out of this foxhole with his back to us. So he said, "I'm going to try to get that guy." But he said, "You lay against this tree and put your rifle right on his neck. If he turns, shoot, because," he said, "I'll be crawling and I won't have a chance." So I laid against that tree and ready to shoot, and he crawled up to that foxhole, which was probably 35, 40, 50 yards maybe, and he poked this German in the back of the neck with his carbine, and he went like this, and then he went like this, and I thought, well, what are you doing? So he made the German come up, and he just went all this with his hands. Well, then he got out of the foxhole. That guy come out of the foxhole, and he said, patted like to get on the ground. So he crawled ahead of this little sergeant, and they crawled all the way back to my tree. Well, then right behind the tree was a kind of a drop-off embankment. We got down over the bank, and I said to this sergeant, I said, "Well, what was all this?" And he said, his buddy was sleeping in the hole. And so I got down over this hill, or this little embankment, and I said to the German, I said, "How many's up here?" Because I could speak some German. I was kind of a group interpreter. And he said, "There's 85 of us up around in this timber." So there was about all the conversation right then. And so we waited our few minutes, and pretty soon we hear this hollering, and it says, "Hans, wer bist du?" And come essen. So I said to this guy, I said, "What's your name?" And he said, "Hans. My buddy is wanting me to go eat with him." So we just let him go. We didn't, because we knew there was a bunch of them up there. So we went to the appointed spot, waited till the appointed time, and then we got out of there. We went back to the house, and where there was more guys, so we gathered them up, and we were going to come back and give them guys some help. So we did, and we got back to the hill. Well, here they came. But what had happened, they happened to be crawling along, sneaking along, were close to where this kitchen was, which they didn't know. But here come the whole group of Germans to go eat, with their muskets a rattling and this and that and the other. So they just laid low till the whole line got by them, and then they sneaked out of there and come on down to meet us. So we took the prisoner back then, and of course then they sent him back for interrogation. And so the very next day, all things got quiet down in this little village. There's no activity whatsoever, because we was watching them all the time, So the lieutenant said to me and the sergeant and another fellow, "Go down into this village and see what's going on." Well, we spread out in this field, and just wide open as this floor, you're expecting trouble any minute. Well, we had smoke grenades, which we carried all the time, because on a deal like that, if they'd get to shooting at you, you'd throw that smoke and crawl out of there best you could, which we'd done several times. Well, about the time we got to the edge of the first buildings, I heard this creaking and groaning like a big door opening up, and well, you didn't know what to expect. Well, here was like an old cave, like a storm cellar, with a big door opened up. Well, of course, we dropped down right now, ready to shoot. Well, what it was, probably 25 to 30 civilians come out of that shelter that they were using against that bombing and all the shrapnel and the strafing of the planes. But they were all just, older men and women and children. Well, then one of them said, "Is there a doctor? Do you have a doctor?" And I said, "No, we don't, but we got a medic up there." But then they took me to, and there was a girl about 14, 15, had a bad wound in her leg, and her leg had just started to turn green. And we said, "Well, we'll try to get her some help." But I said, "Where's all the German?" They said they all left because the lieutenant that had orders to delay us, just delay us. They did not attack us, just delay us. And so he got hit by a piece of shrapnel, and the minute he got wounded and they hauled him back, then the rest of them left. So we could go through the village. But that's the end of the story, but that's about old Hans laying getting his buddies asleep in the foxhole.
Now, anything else you care to add? At the end of the war, since you were a replacement, you probably didn't have the points to come home right away.
Well, but I had been over there so long, so I had more points.
So you pretty much...
So I beat the rest of them out of there, see. But it was, to be a replacement is something that, if you've never been one, because like I say, I think altogether, in all those years, I think I was like 18 or 19 Army camps. All the United States, England, this and that and the other, you know, and they're getting around, but most of them were in England. But it was, to be a replacement is different.
Good, yeah.
But
definitely a unique experience and one that I'd not heard before, so thank you so much for telling me about it.
You're more than welcome.
And now we've got it on videotape, so we can put this out on the web for everybody. Thank you, sir.
You bet.